Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the topic of original peoples, and I'm going to be referring more specifically to the peoples that were here in Australia, majority of the people, should I say, that were here in Australia when the English arrived on the land of which we know as Australia so many hundreds of years ago. And the reason I want to talk about this, I guess, is in the context of history and her story. And, as a child, I loved learning about ancient architecture, ancient culture, and the stories. And, sometimes I guess I wondered, would I want to be an archaeologist or a geologist? There were moments, I thought, was that something I'd want to do? But I got, I guess, quite a clear message at some point that it's not something I'm here to do. And obviously now I'm very glad that I did not, because it potentially would have meant there would have been a whole lot of unprogramming that would have had to occur to actually learn about what really is the history of the human and of the earth. And obviously, I'm not an archaeologist, I'm not a geologist, I'm not a scientist. So for me to be sharing this to you, it's more just hey look, here is some concepts, here are some ideas. You do not have to 111% agree, disagree with what I'm sharing. It's not a doctrine. I'm not trying to indoctrinate you into something. It's just a sharing. It's just something that maybe you have thought of, or you have not thought of, you remembered or you have not remembered. And the more I learned about original peoples, in this area of the earth, and especially and of this land, the more I realized the history that we are taught is quite inverted. And inverted in the sense of comparing it to her story. And I knew from my time that I spent in New Zealand and my time, talking with my dad. My father was very interested in the history of New Zealand, and we would talk about different stories and things that he uncovered. And and we often talked about the people that lived in New Zealand, pre-Māori civilization as well. And then I also, as I've moved to Australia, also uncovered that there's lots of stories, similar stories to a certain extent, that we're not told here as well. And not saying that there was a whole civilization pre-original peoples here. I'm just saying there's just a whole lot of, history that's inverted and doesn't actually really tell a full story of what was going on here and how life was here. Pre-British English, let alone also what went on shortly after they came here, right? And what's occurred during that time up to this point. So, with the original peoples of Australia, their stories go back potentially up to 300,000 years. There's 500 nations at least in Australia, and so me saying, some of them have a 300,000 year story does not mean that all 500 nations have a 300,000 year story. I'm just using that as an example to show you the potential length of time of which they have resided here, not only on the earth, but also on this land. And it's not uncommon for they have a lot of mining here in Australia. Obviously not close to suburbia, to cities, not even close to some towns actually. They're very much, a lot of them, and not all of them, especially the open cast or even the underground ones that are on land, are often in very isolated, meaning human isolated areas. But it's not uncommon for ancient artifacts to be found from these mines, in these mines, on a daily basis. And these artifacts are not necessarily should I say, origins within Australia. These could be artifacts from places like Egypt, Mexico, China, and these are not necessarily very recent artifacts. Some of these artifacts, actually most of them, are thousands and thousands of years old. Now, very common for these artifacts to be destroyed before they are disclosed. And I only hear stories about this normally from, the everyday, I don't want to sort of over generalize here, but a lot of the people that work in the mines are men. So a lot of everyday men who work in these places have stories. Not all, but they will have stories of these kind of things that they can share. Maybe they choose not to, and then I'm sure there's probably things within their contract that says that they're not allowed to. Some of the conversations I've had were with people that used to work in mines are no longer there, but I'm sure their contractual obligations may potentially go past their actual terminated contractual expiry date. Anyway, kind of besides the point. And the reason I'm sharing that is as one example of how, actually, not how, but the fact that there was people that did travel to these lands from all over the world to trade and to share wisdom. Because there were a lot of things here, and there are a lot of things here in the sense of a resource to other cultures, which the original peoples here knew about. They knew that they could work with them and they could create things with certain things. But the original peoples here tended to be more focused on the internal technology. And when I say internal technology, I'm talking about the technology that resides within the body of the human. Or what I might call is maybe something a bit more simple technology, and not simple in the sense of like simple-mindedness or stupid or primitive, more in the sense of, instead of collecting all these minerals and making a cell phone to then make a telephone call to some other place in the world, they would have just much rather maybe picked up a mineral from the ground or sat underneath a tree. I'm using these as an example. I'm not saying this is how they all worked with the simple technology. And then we're just able to tap into what some may call as the telepathy space, and communicate with other peoples around the world. They didn't need to externalize their technology in a way in which a lot of us have become quite fascinated with. And they also seen the rise and the downfall of other peoples around the world that got too overly fascinated with external technology and what that did to the civilizations and to the earth and everything in between, if I should say that. So it wasn't like they didn't know how to work with, these supposed fancy technologies that we have today and that we had in other time frames and other timelines. It was often because they knew that it was against their law, L-O-R-E as they call it, to do so. And they often based their laws on natural laws, universal laws. They knew how the earth worked. They knew the reciprocity and the interconnectedness of things. Just because a person or peoples can do something does not necessarily mean that a person or peoples will do something. And I guess the point of me sharing this is to remind people that they were not primitive, even though for some people in the eyes of modernity modern society, they are considered primitive to some. They are just, I guess what some would say is misunderstood. They're not understood. They're not understood about what they were here doing. Because, and often that comes from the person or the peoples that are quite, I guess some could say, disconnected from certain things. You know, potentially the earth, potentially also the realities and the dimensions and all of that sort of thing. The world's beyond the third dimension. You know, the original peoples here in this land had quite a connectedness to, obviously, the Lemurian and the Mu timelines, more so than probably the Atlantean timelines. And as we remember, the Atlanteans were quite fascinated by the external technology, whereas maybe the Mu and Lemurian timelines are a bit more associated with the internal technologies, the more simple, if I can say it that way, technologies. And so there was a lot more of that influence going on within the original people's culture here than the Atlantean. Of course, they had the visitors of the Atlanteans, you know, such as the Egyptians and many other peoples around the world, you know, and they could make up their own perceptions, or they could see, I guess, from a potential outside perspective of what that does. That does not mean that they were how do I put it? They didn't oust them from their community. They didn't refuse to talk to them, or, you know, they still welcomed them upon their visits if the intentions were right. Just because they were of a different genealogy or different timeline or a different culture did not mean that they feared them, or that they refused to communicate and be connected to them. They just knew that this is how we do things here. We're happy to engage with you if the intention is right, and you know, we can live all together on this planet. So yeah, that is really what I sort of wanted to say in regards to original peoples here. Just sort of remind you that they weren't primitive people, and just because they may appear so, I would ask you to have a deeper look as to why. Is it because you don't have the capacity, or is it because you don't want to understand who they are, what they're about? And also curious if you have stories that you'd like to share, you know, and if you have permission to do so.